The night Johnny Carson could hide his tears, the studio lights were blazing, the orchestra was playing, and the familiar applause filled the room. It looked like another ordinary night on The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson walked onto the stage with his famous smile. He waved to the audience, adjusted his jacket, and sat behind his desk. "Good evening, everybody." The audience laughed and applauded. But that night, something was different. Johnny's smile disappeared almost as quickly as it came. His guest was an elderly man named Frank, a retired stagehand who had spent decades working behind the cameras. He had never been famous. Millions had watched the stars on television, but almost nobody knew the people who moved the lights, fixed the microphones, and quietly made the show possible. Frank had been diagnosed with a serious illness. He had one final request. He wanted to sit on the Tonight Show stage one last time. Johnny had known Frank for years. When Frank walked onto the stage, the audience applauded warmly. Johnny stood and shook his hand. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Then Johnny smiled. "Frank, you've been backstage longer than I have." The audience laughed softly. Frank smiled. "I guess I always preferred being where nobody could see me." Johnny looked down. That sentence seemed to hit him harder than anyone expected. Frank told stories about the early days of television. He remembered broken cameras, nervous performers, forgotten lines, and nights when everyone thought the show was going to fall apart. Then Frank reached into his pocket. He pulled out an old photograph. It showed the Tonight Show crew standing together many years earlier. Johnny stared at it. One by one, Frank pointed to the people in the photograph. "Some are gone now," he whispered. Johnny became silent. The studio audience stopped laughing. Frank looked at Johnny. "You know what I learned working backstage?" Johnny shook his head. "People remember the stars," Frank said, "but the people backstage remember everything." Johnny slowly lowered his eyes. For a moment, the legendary host seemed less like a television icon and more like an old friend who had suddenly realized how quickly time had passed. Frank continued, "I watched you make millions of people laugh, but sometimes after the cameras stopped, you looked tired." Johnny smiled faintly. "I suppose we all do." Frank nodded, then he said something that left the entire studio silent. "Johnny, don't wait until the lights go out to tell people you love them." Johnny looked at him. His eyes became wet. The cameras remained on. For once, Johnny Carson had no joke, no punchline, no clever response. He simply reached across the desk and held Frank's hand. The audience began applauding. Johnny tried to smile, but his voice trembled. "Thank you, Frank." Frank squeezed his hand. "You gave us a lot of good nights." Johnny looked toward the audience. "And you gave us a lot of good memories." The orchestra remained silent. The applause slowly faded. Johnny wiped his eye and tried to continue the show. But everyone in the room understood. That night wasn't really about television. It was about time. It was about the people who stand beside us while we're chasing our dreams, and how often we forget to tell them how much they mean to us. When the final camera light turned red, Johnny looked toward Frank one last time. The audience could no longer hear what he whispered, but Frank smiled, and Johnny smiled back. Then the lights went down, the applause disappeared, and for a few quiet seconds, the most famous man in the room simply sat there, holding the hand of an old friend. Because sometimes the saddest goodbyes aren't shouted, they're whispered beneath the studio lights. And sometimes, the people who make our lives brighter are the ones standing quietly in the shadows.